Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook vault. The most magnetic person in any room is almost never the loudest one. They are rarely the most conventionally attractive, the most credentialed, or the most demonstrably accomplished by the metrics the room uses to assign value. They are the one whose presence generates a specific and unnameable sensation in everyone around them, a pull that the people experiencing it cannot fully explain and therefore cannot fully resist. You have felt this pull. You have been in the presence of someone who seemed to occupy more space than their physical dimensions justified, whose silence carried more weight than other people's speeches, whose approval you found yourself wanting before you had consciously decided to want it. And you have almost certainly wondered, in the honest privacy of your own assessment, what that person had that you did not, and whether it was something that could be learned, or whether it was the kind of thing that arrives at birth and cannot be constructed afterward. The answer to that question is the entire subject of this text, and the answer is not the one the self-development industry has been selling you. The industry's answer is presence, which it defines as a set of behaviors. Speak more slowly, take up more physical space, make sustained eye contact, project confidence through your posture and your vocal tone. These instructions are not wrong in the way that false information is wrong. They are wrong in the way that a description of swimming is wrong when you hand it to someone who is drowning. The behaviors are real. The magnetic individuals you have observed do exhibit them, but the behaviors are outputs of something internal, downstream consequences of a specific internal architecture, and attempting to produce them directly without the internal architecture that generates them naturally produces a performance that the people around you detect with the same precision that a trained musician detects someone playing in tune but without feeling. The notes are correct, something essential is absent. If you have spent years working on your confidence, your communication, your personal brand, your leadership presence, and the gap between where you are and the magnetic figures you observe in your environment has not closed in proportion to the effort invested, this is the diagnosis. You have been working on the outputs. This text works on the source. And the source, once correctly understood and correctly developed, generates the outputs automatically, without maintenance, without performance, and without the cognitive overhead that performance requires, leaving the full capacity of your attention available for the people and the situations in front of you, which is itself one of the primary generators of the magnetic pull you have been attempting to produce through behavioral modification. In every room you enter where someone is operating at the level of genuine magnetic leadership, there is a specific dynamic running that most people in the room are entirely unaware of. The magnetic individual is not trying to be perceived in any particular way. They have resolved, at a level deep enough to have become structural rather than effortful, the need for the room's perception to validate their own internal assessment of themselves. That resolution is not arrogance. Arrogance is a performance of certainty that conceals underlying uncertainty, and it reads as arrogance precisely because the concealment is imperfect and the underlying uncertainty is detectable. What the magnetic individual has is something categorically different, a genuine structural independence from the room's verdict, not because they do not care about people, but because their sense of their own value does not require the room's confirmation to remain intact. And that independence is the most powerful social signal a human being can emit because it communicates at the level of the social processing systems that every person in the room is running continuously and unconsciously, that this individual has already been validated by a standard higher than anything the room can provide. The people who are most desperately seeking your approval are the people whose approval feels least valuable. The people who seem entirely indifferent to whether you approve of them are the people whose approval you most want to earn. This is not a paradox. It is the precise operation of a social intelligence system that evolved to identify the individuals most worth following, and the signal it is detecting is the signal of genuine internal authority, the signal that says this person's assessment of reality is not primarily shaped by the social pressure of the immediate environment. That signal is magnetic not because it is rare, though it is, but because it is the signal that evolution has wired human beings to orient toward, the signal of the individuals whose judgment can be trusted precisely because it is not for sale to whoever is applying the most social pressure in the current moment. The construction of that internal authority is not a matter of becoming colder or more detached from human connection. The magnetic leaders who have developed it are frequently described by the people around them as deeply present, genuinely interested, and unusually capable of making individuals feel seen and understood. The detachment that generates the magnetic pull is not an emotional detachment from people, it is a structural detachment from the need for those people's approval as a condition of the magnetic individual's own internal stability. The distinction between those two forms of detachment is the entire difference between the genuinely magnetic and the merely aloof, and it is a distinction that the people around you detect with an accuracy that no behavioral technique can reliably deceive. The aura that surrounds genuinely magnetic leaders, the quality that people describe with words like presence, gravitas, and charisma, is not a single thing. It is a composite of several distinct internal developments that, when present simultaneously, produce an external effect that is greater than the sum of its parts. Understanding each of those developments separately and understanding how they interact to produce the composite effect is the map that this text will construct, not the map of what magnetic leadership looks like from the outside, which is the map that behavioral frameworks provide. The map of what it is built from on the inside, which is the only map that produces the real thing rather than its imitation. The foundational internal development of magnetic leadership is the complete and permanent resolution of what can be precisely described as the approval dependency loop. The approval dependency loop is not a personality flaw and not a psychological disorder. It is the default operating mode of a social species that evolved in environments where the approval of the group was literally a survival variable, where exclusion from the collective meant exposure to threats that the individual could not survive alone, and where the continuous monitoring of the group's assessment of your standing was therefore a rational and adaptive behavior. The loop operates as follows. You enter a social situation, your social monitoring systems, running automatically and below the threshold of conscious awareness, begin assessing the approval signals being emitted by the people around you. Signals of approval produce a micro-release of neurochemical reward that reinforces the behaviors that generated them. Signals of disapproval or indifference produce a micro-release of neurochemical threat response that motivates behavioral adjustment to recover the lost approval. Over time, the cumulative effect of this loop is a behavioral repertoire that has been shaped primarily by the approval preferences of the various social environments you have moved through, rather than by your own values, your own judgment, or your own assessment of what is true and what is effective. The person who emerges from this process is socially functional, often highly skilled at reading and responding to social environments, and almost entirely unable to generate the signal of internal authority that magnetic leadership requires, because that signal requires a behavioral repertoire that is visibly shaped by something other than the approval preferences of the current environment. The resolution of the approval dependency loop does not mean the elimination of social sensitivity. The magnetic leaders who have resolved it are typically more socially sensitive than the people around them, not less, because their attention is not consumed by the monitoring and management of their own approval status, and is therefore fully available for the genuine perception of the people they are with. What changes is the destination of the social information they perceive. In the unresolved loop, social information about approval and disapproval flows directly into the behavioral adjustment system, producing automatic modifications to behavior designed to recover or maintain approval. In the resolved state, the same social information flows into the analytical system, where it is processed as data about the other person, about the situation, and about what response would be most effective and most aligned with the magnetic individual's own values and judgment. The information is the same. Its destination, and therefore its effect on behavior, is entirely different. The practical resolution of the approval dependency loop requires a specific sequence of internal work that is distinct from the generic confidence-building exercises that the self-development industry prescribes for this problem. Generic confidence building addresses the symptom, the felt experience of social anxiety, and the behavioral patterns it produces, without addressing the structural cause, the orientation of the self-evaluation system toward external inputs as its primary source of calibration. The structural resolution requires a fundamental reorientation of the self-evaluation system toward internal inputs, which means the development of a sufficiently precise and sufficiently honest internal standard against which your own behavior, thinking, and character can be evaluated without reference to the approval of anyone in the current social environment. This internal standard is not self-aggrandizement and not the inflation of self-assessment beyond what the evidence supports. It is precisely the opposite, a rigorous, honest, and continuously updated evaluation of your own thinking, your own behavior, and your own character against a standard that you have defined through genuine reflection on your values and your understanding of what constitutes excellence in the domains that matter to you. The person who has developed this internal standard has, for the first time, a self-evaluation instrument that does not fluctuate with the social weather. Their assessment of their own thinking does not change because someone in the room expressed disapproval of it. Their commitment to a position does not dissolve because the social pressure against it intensifies. Their sense of their own value does not require replenishment from external sources because it is generated internally by the continuous practice of holding themselves to a standard they have defined and meeting it with a consistency they can honestly assess. The effect of this internal standard on the social signal emitted is profound and immediate. People in the social environment detect, without being able to articulate what they are detecting, that this individual's behavior is being generated by something other than the approval preferences of the room. They detect that the social pressure they might apply, consciously or unconsciously, to shape this person's behavior to match their preferences is not producing the expected behavioral adjustment. And the detection of that resistance, that structural independence from social pressure, generates the specific neurological response that is experienced as magnetic pull, the response that says, this person operates from a different authority than the one that governs most of the people in this room, and that different authority is worth orienting toward. The development of a genuine internal standard is therefore not primarily a confidence exercise. It is a clarity exercise. It requires the honest answer to questions that most people avoid with considerable ingenuity. What do I actually value, as distinct from what I have been conditioned to value by the environments I moved through? What do I actually believe, as distinct from what I have adopted because it was the position of the groups whose approval I needed? What kind of person do I actually want to be, as distinct from the kind of person that the various social environments I inhabit reward with their approval? These questions are uncomfortable, precisely because honest answers to them frequently reveal a significant gap between the values and beliefs that are currently shaping behavior and the values and beliefs that a genuinely self-determined individual would choose. That gap is not a source of shame. It is the precise map of the internal work required to develop the structural independence that magnetic authority is built on. Calibrated mystery is the most misunderstood component of magnetic leadership because it is most frequently described in terms of what it looks like from the outside rather than what it is on the inside, and the outside description generates imitation strategies that produce the opposite of the intended effect. From the outside, calibrated mystery looks like a person who does not reveal everything about themselves, who maintains areas of their inner life and their thinking that are not immediately accessible to the people around them, who projects a sense of depth that exceeds what has been explicitly communicated. The imitation strategy that this description generates is deliberate withholding, the conscious decision to share less, to be more guarded, to cultivate an air of secrecy through the strategic management of self-disclosure. That strategy fails consistently and for a precise reason. Deliberate withholding is detectable. The social processing systems that run in the people around you are extraordinarily sensitive to the difference between a person who has depth that has not yet been revealed and a person who is performing appearance of depth through the management of what they reveal. The first generates curiosity. The second generates a specific form of social discomfort that people describe as feeling like the person is playing games, and it produces not magnetic pull, but the opposite, a withdrawal of genuine interest and engagement. Genuine calibrated mystery is not a disclosure management strategy. It is the natural external expression of an internal life that is actually rich enough, complex enough, and continuously developing enough to exceed what any single interaction or series of interactions can fully communicate. The magnetic individual is not withholding. They simply have more interior territory than can be mapped in the time available. And the people around them sense this surplus of interior depth not through any deliberate signal, but through the accumulated experience of interactions that consistently reveals something new, something unexpected, something that contradicts or complicates the model of this person that has been forming in the observer's mind. That continuous revision of the internal model is what generates the compulsive curiosity that calibrated mystery produces. The people around the magnetic individual keep engaging because their model of that person keeps being proven incomplete, and the human mind is constitutionally unable to rest comfortably with an incomplete model of someone it finds significant. The development of genuine interior depth, the kind that generates calibrated mystery as a natural byproduct rather than a performance, requires a specific orientation toward your own inner life that most people never develop because the environments they inhabit do not reward it and frequently actively discourage it. The environments that most people spend the majority of their time in, professional environments, social media environments, the informal social environments of peer groups, reward the legible, the communicable, and the immediately relatable. They reward self-disclosure that produces connection through shared recognition, the revelation of thoughts and experiences that the audience can immediately map onto their own thoughts and experiences. They penalize the obscure, the complex, and the genuinely individual, the revelation of inner territory that the audience cannot immediately map onto their own experience and therefore cannot immediately validate. The systematic pursuit of legibility and immediate relatability, maintained across years, produces a person whose inner life has been pruned to the dimensions that their social environment can accommodate. The complexity that did not generate validation was gradually abandoned. The perspectives that produced social friction were gradually moderated. The interests that could not be shared and understood were gradually allowed to atrophy. The result is a person who is socially functional, immediately relatable, and entirely transparent. And transparency is the precise opposite of the interior surplus that generates calibrated mystery. There is nothing hidden because there is nothing that exceeds the dimensions of what has already been communicated, and the people around this person sense that completeness, not as intimacy, but as a ceiling on the depth of engagement that is available. The reconstruction of genuine interior depth begins with the deliberate reclamation of the inner territory that social pruning removed. This means the development of intellectual interests that are pursued for their own intrinsic reward rather than for their social communicability. It means the cultivation of perspectives on significant questions that are genuinely your own, developed through the serious engagement with ideas rather than adopted from the most socially acceptable positions available in your environment. It means the practice of solitude as a developmental resource rather than a social deficit, the regular creation of conditions in which your inner life can develop without the continuous influence of social input that shapes it toward legibility and relatability. And it means the development of a relationship with your own emotional and psychological complexity that does not require external validation to sustain, the capacity to hold and process the full range of your inner experience without the compulsion to immediately communicate it and receive the validation that communication provides. The external effect of this interior development on the social signal you emit is the authentic version of what deliberate withholding attempts to produce through management. When your interior life genuinely exceeds what any interaction can communicate, that surplus is detectable in the quality of your presence. It is detectable in the way you respond to questions, which suggests a consideration of dimensions that the question did not explicitly invite, but that your thinking naturally encompasses. It is detectable in the way you listen, which conveys the processing of multiple layers of what is being said simultaneously, rather than the simple reception of the surface content. It is detectable in the moments of silence that precede your most significant contributions, which read not as the absence of thought, but as the compression of more thought than the words that follow can fully contain. These are not techniques. They are the natural behavioral expressions of a genuinely developed interior life, and they generate the specific quality of social fascination that calibrated mystery produces, not because they were designed to do so, but because the social processing systems of the people around you are accurately detecting the interior surplus that produces them. The fascination is a correct response to a real signal, which is why it is sustainable in a way that the performance of mystery never is. Sovereign emotional presence is the quality that people describe when they say that a specific individual made them feel like the only person in the room. It is among the most powerful generators of the magnetic pole that this text is concerned with. Constructing, and it is among the most consistently misunderstood because its surface description, making people feel seen and heard, has been adopted by the communication coaching industry and converted into a set of active listening techniques that produce a simulacrum of genuine presence without the internal state that makes genuine presence possible. The techniques instruct you to maintain eye contact, to nod at appropriate intervals, to reflect back what the other person has said, to ask follow-up questions that demonstrate you were listening. These behaviors are the behavioral signature of genuine presence, but performing them without the internal state they are supposed to express produces an interaction that most people experience as vaguely unsatisfying, without being able to identify precisely why. The presence was performed. They could feel that it was performed, and performed presence is not what generates the magnetic effect. Genuine presence is. Genuine presence is the complete direction of your attention toward the person in front of you, not as a deliberate act of will that must be maintained against the competing pull of your own internal preoccupations, but as the natural default state of an individual whose internal preoccupations are not generating sufficient noise to compete with the external reality of the person they are with. The primary obstacle to genuine presence is not distraction in the environmental sense, the phone on the table, the ambient noise of the room, the other people visible in the peripheral field. These are trivial obstacles that genuine presence overcomes automatically. The primary obstacle is internal, the continuous processing of your own self-referential concerns, your assessment of how you are being perceived, your management of the impression you are creating, your monitoring of your own approval status within the interaction, your planning of what you will say next while the other person is still speaking. All of this internal processing is occurring in the same cognitive space that genuine attention to the other person requires, and it is competing with that attention for the limited bandwidth of conscious processing capacity. The resolution of the approval dependency loop described in the previous section is therefore not only a development in its own right, it is the prerequisite for sovereign emotional presence, because the approval dependency loop is the primary generator of the internal noise that prevents genuine presence from occurring naturally. When your monitoring of the room's assessment of you is running at full capacity, your attention to the people in the room as individuals, as sources of genuine information about their inner life and their actual needs, is proportionally reduced. The social interaction that results is one in which you are present in the physical sense but absent in the way that matters, and the people you interact with detect this absence with a precision that renders every active listening technique you deploy insufficient compensation for what is actually missing. The development of sovereign emotional presence, once the approval dependency noise has been reduced through the work described in the previous section, requires a specific additional development: the cultivation of genuine curiosity about other people as a primary orientation rather than as a socially motivated performance. Most people's curiosity about others is selective and instrumental. They are curious about people who can provide them with something they want, whether that something is approval, information, opportunity, or connection. They are curious in the presence of novelty and in the presence of status. Their curiosity diminishes in proportion to the perceived irrelevance of the person to their current concerns, and the people they interact with detect the presence or absence of genuine curiosity with a sensitivity that is independent of the behavioral signals being produced. You can ask all the right questions and still convey through the quality of your attention to the answers that the answers are not genuinely interesting to you. Genuine curiosity about people, the kind that generates sovereign emotional presence as a natural consequence, is not a personality trait that some people have and others lack. It is a developed orientation that requires a specific cognitive reframe, the recognition that every person you encounter is operating from an interior world that is as complex, as historically layered, and as internally consistent from its own perspective as your own interior world, and that the access to that interior world that genuine conversation provides is one of the most significant sources of understanding about human reality that is available to anyone who is paying sufficient attention. The magnetic leaders who generate the experience of being the only person in the room are not performing interest in the people they are with. They have developed a genuine appreciation for the complexity of the human interior that makes every person they encounter a source of information that their own interior life cannot provide. And that appreciation is detectable in the quality of their attention in a way that no technique can replicate. The practical cultivation of this curiosity requires a deliberate expansion of the questions you bring to your interactions with people, beyond the questions that your immediate concerns and your social role make obvious. Not questions designed to extract specific information, but questions motivated by genuine interest in understanding how this specific person's interior world is organized, what they find significant, what they find difficult, what they understand about their own experience that most people in their position do not understand. These questions are not always asked aloud. The orientation they represent shapes the quality of attention you bring to everything the other person communicates, including the things they communicate without intending to, the hesitations, the word choices, the topics they approach and then redirect away from, the moments when their affect does not match their content. A person receiving that quality of attention experiences something that is genuinely rare in most human interactions: sensation of being fully perceived rather than partially acknowledged, and that sensation generates a specific form of loyalty and orientation toward the person providing it that is one of the primary social mechanisms of magnetic leadership. Gravitational conviction is not the same thing as strong opinions, and the distinction matters enormously because strong opinions are among the most common imitations of the quality this section describes, and among the most effective ways of producing the opposite of the magnetic effect they are intended to generate. Strong opinions are positions held with visible intensity and defended with visible energy against the social pressure that challenges them. They are recognizable by the emotional investment that their defense requires, the elevation in vocal intensity, the increase in the speed and density of argumentation, the subtle but detectable shift in the holder's physiological state when the position is challenged. Strong opinions communicate through all of these signals simultaneously that the holder's internal stability is partially dependent on the position being validated, and that dependency is the precise opposite of the internal architecture that gravitational conviction expresses. Gravitational conviction is positions held with such complete internal settlement that the social pressure applied against them does not reach the level of the holder's emotional system. The position is not defended because it does not feel under attack. A challenge to a position held with gravitational conviction is experienced not as a threat requiring defensive mobilization, but as information about the challenger's current understanding, information that may be worth engaging with seriously if it contains genuine substance, and that can be acknowledged and set aside without friction if it does not. The magnetic individual who holds a position with gravitational conviction does not become more intense when the position is challenged. They frequently become more still, more economical in their response, and more genuinely interested in understanding what the challenger's perspective reveals about the question at hand. This response pattern is the behavioral signature of an internal state in which the validity of the position is not contingent on the room's agreement with it, and it is one of the most powerful social signals that the magnetic architecture produces. The development of gravitational conviction requires two parallel internal developments that are distinct but mutually reinforcing. The first is epistemic rigor, the development of beliefs and positions through a process that is serious enough, thorough enough, and honest enough about contrary evidence that the resulting positions carry genuine internal weight. Most people's positions on significant questions are adopted rather than developed, absorbed from the social and in facing a finite informational environments, they inhabit the informational environments they inhabit with a degree of critical examination that is sufficient to produce a sense of ownership, without being sufficient to produce the kind of deeply grounded understanding that makes a position genuinely stable under challenge. The difference between an adopted position and a developed one is legible in the holder's response to serious challenge. The adopted position becomes defensive because the challenge threatens a structure that was not built to bear the load of serious scrutiny, while the developed position becomes more articulate under challenge because the challenge activates the understanding that was built into the position's construction. The practice of epistemic rigor requires a deliberate orientation toward the strongest available versions of contrary positions rather than the weakest. Most people, when they encounter a position contrary to one they hold, engage with the version of it that is easiest to dismiss, and the dismissal reinforces the sense that their own position is robust without actually testing it against genuine intellectual challenge. The magnetic individual who has developed gravitational conviction has done the opposite. They have sought out the most sophisticated, most well-evidenced, most seriously argued versions of positions contrary to their own, engaged with them honestly, updated their position where the evidential foundation of a position genuinely warranted updating, and arrived at a settled position that has survived the most serious challenge they could find, rather than the most convenient. That settled position carries a quality of internal authority that is detectable in the social signal it emits. The second parallel development required for gravitational conviction is values clarity, a precise and examined understanding of the values that underlie your positions, sufficiently clear that you can distinguish between positions you hold because the evidence supports them and positions you hold because they are consistent with your values, and sufficiently honest that you can acknowledge when a challenge has successfully engaged with the evidential foundation of a position without simultaneously threatening the values foundation. Most people conflate the evidential and values dimensions of their positions in a way that makes both simultaneously more fragile and more defended than they should be. When evidence and values are conflated, a successful challenge to the evidence feels like a challenge to the values, and the values defense activates with an intensity that is disproportionate to what is actually at stake in the evidential question. Separating these dimensions produces positions that are simultaneously more intellectually flexible because the evidential component can be updated without threatening the values, and more genuinely stable because the values foundation does not depend on any specific evidential claim for its validity. The social effect of gravitational conviction, when both of these internal developments are present, is the quality that people describe as knowing what they stand for. The magnetic individual who has developed it does not need to announce their positions frequently or defend them loudly. Their positions are legible in their behavior, in their choices, in the consistency of their responses across social contexts and different social pressures, and in the absence of the behavioral variability that signals a person whose positions shift with the social weather. That consistency is itself a powerful attractor because human beings are social organisms who depend on the predictability of the individuals they orient toward, and the individual whose positions and values are genuinely consistent across contexts provides a quality of social reliability that most people in most environments have learned not to expect. The interaction between gravitational conviction and the sovereign emotional presence described in the previous section produces a specific combination that is among the most powerful generators of the magnetic effect, the individual who listens with complete, genuine attention to everything you say and then responds from a position of such complete internal settlement that the response feels like it came from somewhere deeper than the immediate interaction. That combination, genuine receptivity combined with genuine groundedness, is experienced by the people on the receiving end as a form of contact with a kind of authority that most human interactions do not provide. And the hunger for that contact is one of the primary mechanisms through which magnetic leaders accumulate the voluntary following that this text is concerned with constructing. The communication quality of magnetic leaders is not primarily a matter of eloquence, though many of them are eloquent. It is not primarily a matter of vocabulary, rhetorical skill, or the ability to construct arguments with logical precision, though these capabilities are often present. The defining characteristic of magnetic communication is something more fundamental than any of these, and it is a characteristic that most communication training entirely misses, because it is not located in the communication itself, but in the relationship between the communicator and what they are communicating. Magnetic leaders say things that sound like they were discovered rather than constructed. Their words carry the specific quality of statements that have been arrived at through genuine engagement with the reality they describe, rather than assembled from available language to produce a desired effect on the listener. And the people receiving those words detect this quality with the same precision they bring to every other dimension of the magnetic signal, which means that the gap between genuine discovery and skilled construction, however narrow it appears from the outside, is consistently detectable from the inside of the receiving experience. The development of this communication quality begins with a fundamental reorientation of the purpose of communication in your own operating framework. Most people communicate primarily to produce an effect, to persuade, to impress, to connect, to manage a perception, to achieve a social outcome of some kind. This effect orientation is not wrong in the sense that these are not legitimate purposes. They are. But when the production of the effect is the primary driver of what is said and how it is said, the communication takes on a quality of engineering that is detectable in its texture. The listener senses, without being able to fully articulate what they are sensing, that the words were selected for their effect rather than for their accuracy, and that sensing produces a micro-withdrawal of trust that accumulates across the interaction into a general assessment of this person as someone who is managing their communication rather than someone who is genuinely saying what they think. The reorientation required is toward accuracy as the primary purpose of communication, specifically the accuracy of your own thinking as expressed in language. This means developing the habit of saying what you actually think rather than what you have assessed as the optimal thing to say in this context, and it means developing the precision of language that allows what you actually think to be expressed with sufficient clarity that the gap between your internal reality and its external expression is minimized rather than exploited. These two developments, the commitment to genuine expression and the precision of language that makes it possible, are related but distinct, and both require deliberate cultivation in a social environment that consistently rewards managed communication over genuine expression. The commitment to genuine expression is the more psychologically demanding of the two developments because it requires the acceptance of a specific social risk that most people are not willing to take, the risk that what you actually think, expressed honestly, will not produce the effect you would prefer. That risk is real. Genuine expression of actual thinking will sometimes produce disagreement, sometimes produce social friction, and sometimes produce outcomes that managed communication would have avoided. The magnetic leaders who have made this commitment have accepted that risk, not because they are indifferent to outcomes, but because they understand that the cumulative social effect of consistently genuine expression, the trust it builds, the authority it generates, the quality of relationships it produces, outweighs the occasional social cost of an honest statement that produced an unwelcome reaction. And they have understood that the alternative, the managed communication that most people default to, produces a social environment in which they are responded to as a managed communicator, which means that the responses they receive are themselves managed. Entire interaction becomes an exchange of managed surfaces that generates no genuine understanding and no genuine connection. The precision of language that genuine expression requires is developed through a specific practice that most people deprioritize in favor of the volume of communication that contemporary social environments reward. The practice is the deliberate search for the most accurate possible word or construction for the thought being expressed, not the most impressive word, not the most rhetorically effective construction, but the most accurate one, the one that comes closest to the actual texture of the thought, rather than an approximation of it that happens to be more readily available. This practice slows communication down in the early stages of its development, produces more pauses and more moments of visible searching for language, and requires the tolerance of a social discomfort that the pace of most contemporary conversation does not readily accommodate. The magnetic leaders who have developed this precision are frequently described as thoughtful in their speech, as people who seem to be actually finding the words rather than retrieving them pre-assembled, and that quality of apparent discovery in the communication is itself part of the magnetic signal because it conveys that the thinking is happening in real time rather than being retrieved from a pre-constructed repertoire of positions and responses. The combination of genuine expression and linguistic precision produces a communication style whose defining characteristic is economy. Magnetic communicators tend to say less than the people around them, and to have what they say carry more weight, not because they have mastered the rhetorical technique of strategic silence, but because the filtering of genuine expression through the discipline of linguistic precision removes the substantial proportion of most people's communication that is neither accurate nor necessary, the padding that fills the space between genuine thoughts, the elaboration that repeats in different words what has already been said, the qualification that hedges genuine positions into positions that are no longer genuinely held. What remains after that filtering is communication whose density of actual content per unit of expression is high enough to register differently from the ambient communication of most environments, and that registration is experienced by the people receiving it as the specific quality of significance that magnetic communication produces. The integration of this communication quality with the internal developments described in the previous sections, the resolved approval dependency, the calibrated mystery of genuine interior depth, the sovereign emotional presence, and the integration of the 5 components described in the previous sections into a unified presence is not achieved through the conscious coordination of separately developed capabilities, deployed in combination when the situation calls for all of them simultaneously. That approach, the approach of managing multiple internal developments as distinct modules to be activated in appropriate contexts, produces exactly the quality of managed performance that this text has consistently identified as the primary obstacle to genuine magnetic authority. The integration that produces a unified magnetic presence is a different kind of achievement entirely. It is the development of a single underlying internal state from which all 5 components emerge simultaneously and naturally, the way that a single source of light produces illumination in every direction without the light having to decide which direction to illuminate next. The underlying internal state that produces this unified emergence is what can be precisely described as settled self-possession. Settled self-possession is not confidence in the conventional sense, not the felt experience of certainty about outcomes or the absence of doubt about your own capabilities. It is something more structural and more durable than felt confidence, which fluctuates with circumstances and therefore cannot be the foundation of a presence that is consistent across different social contexts and different levels of social pressure. Settled self-possession is the condition of a person who has completed enough of the internal work described in this text that their relationship with their own identity, their own values, their own thinking, and their own emotional experience is no longer primarily organized around the management of external inputs. They are not managing impressions, not monitoring approval, not performing depth, not constructing positions for their social effect, not engineering presence through behavioral technique. They are simply present from a foundation that has been built to be stable under the conditions that most people's internal foundations are not stable under, and that stability is the source from which every component of the magnetic signal flows without requiring separate management or conscious deployment. The practical experience of settled self-possession is distinct from its description, and the distinction matters because the description can be misread as a state of serene detachment that is incompatible with the full engagement that magnetic presence requires. Settled self-possession does not feel like detachment. It feels like full engagement from a foundation that does not move when the engagement becomes challenging. It feels like the capacity to be fully present with conflict, with challenge, with the full complexity of difficult social and emotional situations without the foundation shifting beneath you in a way that requires your attention to be redirected from the situation to the management of your own internal state. The person in settled self-possession is more fully engaged with what is in front of them, not less, because their internal foundation is not competing for the attention that the situation deserves. The development of settled self-possession as a unified internal state, rather than as a collection of separately developed capabilities, requires a specific practice that integrates all of the previous developments through a single discipline. The discipline of consistent action from values under conditions of social pressure. This discipline is not practiced in conditions of low social pressure, where acting from values costs nothing and therefore builds nothing. It is practiced in the specific moments when the social pressure to adjust your position, moderate your expression, perform a version of yourself that is more acceptable to the current environment, or defer to the social consensus in a way that contradicts your own genuine assessment is most intense. Acting from values in those moments, consistently and without the dramatic internal struggle that characterizes the early stages of the practice, is what builds the internal foundation that settled self-possession requires. Each instance of that consistency adds a layer to the foundation. Each instance of capitulation to social pressure removes one. The foundation grows or erodes in direct proportion to the consistency of the practice across the full range of social contexts and social pressures that your life provides. The social effect of settled self-possession, when it has been developed to a sufficient degree of consistency, is the specific quality of presence that people describe as gravitational. The person who has it does not need to claim authority. The authority is legible in the quality of their presence, before they have said anything, because the social processing systems of the people around them are accurately detecting a foundation that most people's internal architecture does not have, and are responding to that detection with the voluntary following that the detection warrants. The maintenance of settled self-possession across time and across the varying conditions that life provides is not automatic once achieved. Every significant life transition, every new social environment, every sustained period of adversity or uncertainty tests the foundation in ways that may reveal areas where the construction is less complete than the stable periods suggested. The magnetic leaders who maintain their presence across decades rather than displaying it only during their peak periods treat these tests not as evidence of failure, but as diagnostic information about the areas where the internal work is not yet complete, and they return to that work with the same orientation they brought it to initially, without the dramatic internal struggle. Self-judgment that most people bring to the discovery that their development has limits they had not previously identified. The voluntary following that magnetic leadership generates is categorically different from the compliance that positional authority produces. And understanding that difference is essential for anyone who intends to exercise the influence that the internal developments described in this text make available. Compliance is behavior produced by the calculation that the cost of not complying exceeds the cost of complying, a calculation that is continuously running in people who are subject to positional authority, and that produces behavior which persists precisely as long as the authority structure that makes it costly not to comply remains intact. The moment the authority structure changes, the compliance recalculates and may reverse with the speed that reveals how little genuine orientation toward the authority figure was ever present beneath the behavioral surface. Organizations built primarily on compliance are fragile in proportion to their dependence on it, because they're only as stable as the authority structures that enforce the calculation, and authority structures are more vulnerable to disruption than the people who depend on them typically appreciate until the disruption occurs. Voluntary following is produced by an entirely different mechanism. It is the behavioral expression of a genuine internal orientation to a specific individual, an orientation that has been generated not by the calculation of costs and benefits under an authority structure, but by the accurate detection of qualities in that individual that the following person's social intelligence system has assessed as genuinely worth orienting toward. Voluntary following does not recalculate when the authority structure changes because it was never dependent on the authority structure. It is anchored in the detected qualities of the individual, and those qualities do not change with organizational restructuring, leadership transitions, or the political cycles that erode positional authority. This is why the influence of genuinely magnetic leaders frequently outlasts their formal positions, follows them across organizational boundaries, and generates orientation from people who have never been subject to their positional authority and have no instrumental reason to follow them. The exercise of the influence that voluntary following provides requires a specific understanding of the obligation it creates, because voluntary following is not unconditional, and its continuation is not guaranteed by its initiation. The people who follow a magnetic leader voluntarily are doing so on the basis of an implicit assessment that the qualities they detected are real, consistent, and likely to remain so. They are extending a form of trust that is different in character from the trust gravitational conviction produce. That transmission, when it is genuine, generates in the recipient a curiosity and an orientation toward the magnetic individual that precedes any direct contact. And that pre-contact orientation is the mechanism through which magnetic leadership scales beyond the limits of personal interaction. The full expression of magnetic leadership, the condition in which the internal developments described throughout this text are sufficiently integrated and sufficiently consistent that their social effects operate at scale without requiring the magnetic individual's continuous active presence to sustain them, is not the destination of a finite development process. It is the ongoing practice of a person who has made a fundamental commitment to the development of their own interior life as the primary source from which their external influence flows, and who understands that the depth of that influence at any given moment is an accurate reflection of the depth of that interior development rather than a function of the techniques they have mastered or the positions they have acquired. What you have built by the time the internal developments described throughout this text have reached sufficient depth and sufficient integration is not a version of yourself that has been optimized for social effect. It is a version of yourself that has been cleared of the accumulated distortions that social environments install in people who have not examined them, the approval dependencies, the pruned interior life, the managed communication, the adopted positions, the performed presence, the fragile confidence that requires continuous external replenishment to remain functional. What remains after that clearing is not a constructed identity. It is the identity that was always structurally available beneath the distortions, now expressed with the consistency and the completeness that the distortions previously prevented. This distinction matters for the way you understand the project this text has been describing. It is not the project of becoming someone different. It is the project of becoming someone more fully yourself, in the specific sense of a self that is organized around your own values, your own genuine thinking, your own developed interior life, rather than around the social inputs that most people's identities are primarily organized around without their conscious awareness or consent. The magnetic quality that emerges from this process is not a layer added on top of who you were before. It is the natural expression of who you are when the layers that were added by social conditioning have been removed, examined, and replaced with developments that you chose through genuine reflection rather than absorbed through social osmosis. Extended to an institution or contractual arrangement because it is personal rather than structural, based on the perceived character of the individual rather than on the guarantees of a system. That personal trust is both more valuable and more fragile than structural trust. More valuable because it generates a quality of commitment and engagement that structural trust cannot produce, and more fragile because it is directly vulnerable to any evidence that the qualities on which it was based were performed rather than genuine, situational rather than structural, or subject to the same approval-dependent variability that characterizes the people who have not done the internal work this text describes. The primary obligation of the magnetic leader toward the voluntary following they have generated is therefore consistency, not in the superficial sense of predictability across low-stakes situations, but in the deep sense of maintaining the internal foundation from which the magnetic qualities emerge, across the full range of conditions that leadership provides, including the high-stakes, high-pressure, high-ambiguity conditions that most severely test whether the qualities are genuinely structural or merely the expression of favorable circumstances. The people who follow voluntarily are continuously, if unconsciously, assessing the consistency of the qualities they detected, and the most consequential assessments occurred during the moments of genuine difficulty, when the organizational environment is under stress, when the leader's own position is under challenge, when the path forward is genuinely unclear, and the temptation to manage perceptions rather than maintain genuine presence is most acute. The magnetic leader who maintains their internal foundation during those moments deepens the voluntary following they have generated. The magnetic leader who does not, who reverts to approval-dependent behavior or managed communication or positional authority when the genuine qualities are most needed, discovers that voluntary following withdraws with the speed and completeness that positional compliance never does, because the trust that generated it was personal, and the violation of that trust is experienced as personal. The growth of voluntary following over time, its expansion beyond the individuals who have had direct contact with the magnetic leader into communities and networks of people who have not, operates through a mechanism that is distinct from reputation management or personal branding in the conventional sense. It operates through the transmission of genuine experience by the people who have had direct contact, and the specific quality of that transmission is determined by the depth of the orientation they developed. People transmit their experience of a magnetic leader not primarily through descriptions of what the leader did or said, the content of their positions, or the achievements they produced, but through the felt quality of what it was like to be in their presence, to receive their attention, to observe their consistency under pressure, to experience the specific sensation of contact with genuine internal authority, that sovereign emotional presence. The people who will follow you voluntarily once this development has reached sufficient depth will not be following a persona. They will be following a person, and the difference between those two things is the entire difference between influence that is durable and influence that is contingent. Personas require maintenance. They require the continuous management of the gap between the projected image and the internal reality. And that management is both cognitively expensive and ultimately unsustainable, because the gap it is managing tends to widen over time as the persona's requirements diverge further from the internal reality it is concealing. A person, fully developed and genuinely expressed, requires no maintenance of that kind. The consistency that generates trust and deepens voluntary following is automatic, because it is the expression of an internal state rather than the performance of an external standard. The development never completes. This is the final clarification that this text offers, and it is offered not as a discouragement, but as the accurate description of what makes the practice sustainable across a lifetime, rather than finite across a development period. The interior life that generates calibrated mystery never reaches a depth beyond which further depth is unavailable. The approval independence that makes sovereign emotional presence possible never reaches a completeness beyond which further testing is unnecessary. The epistemic rigor that produces gravitational conviction never reaches a thoroughness beyond which further honest examination of your own positions would find nothing worth updating. The linguistic precision that generates magnetic communication never reaches an accuracy beyond which further refinement would produce no closer correspondence between thought and expression. The settled self-possession that integrates all of these into a unified presence never reaches a stability beyond which further challenge would find nothing that moves. The practice is therefore not a path that terminates at a destination. It is a direction of continuous movement, and the magnetic resonance you generate at any point along that path is an accurate function of how far you have moved in that direction from wherever you began. The people who are most magnetic are not the people who completed the development. They are the people who have been moving in that direction most consistently and most honestly for the longest time.
and whose presence therefore carries the accumulated depth of that movement in every interaction they have, every room they enter, and every moment of genuine contact they offer to the people who are fortunate enough to be in their orbit.